from home and this massive shift a lot of us have had to do in how we do things have taken its toll. It is stressful for a number of us. Human beings like patterns, human beings like routines, and to have it upended in sort of like what seems like a short amount of time can be massively taxing. And planning for something that you can't predict is also massively taxing. So here goes the question. Can we take charge of our mental state in order to get through this? I hand it over to Azran to answer that question and his presentation. But be warned, a little heads up, because I've seen his slides. For those of you who have some aversion to blood or a little bit squeamish, it can get a little graphic. But don't let that deter you. I can't wait to see what he has to say. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Michelle, for inviting me. I'm going to kind of jump right in. First, I just want to set the stage, because I think what we're all going through right now is completely unprecedented. I don't think anyone has all the answers, least of all myself. What I want to share from you are my personal experiences of going through journeys of storm and tumultuous adventures over the last 20 years, from 97, 98, 2000 during the dot-com bust, and I had to move my family to Korea because things completely dried up here. And I think, from 2008, 2009, a lot of major challenges. For me, it was one after the other. And in that process, as you can see, I lost all my hair. But as I reflected back, it's always easy in hindsight to think, how do we make sense of all of these massive changes and try to put in place a process, not so much to have the answers, but to understand why it happens and what we can do about that. So I just want to share with you some of the points that I had tried to compile in my book about this journey, right? So especially for me, I had started an airline at the end of 2007. As you can imagine, just as soon as we launched it, early 2008, we had the global credit crunch where all the banks who even had a signed agreement to provide loans backed out, right? Because I discovered something in the loan agreements called material adverse circumstance, which allows the banks to pull out of the commitments that they had already signed and given you, and you're completely stuck with no liquidity, right? And on top of that, while this was happening, we can all remember extreme volatility, right? Where oil prices were hovering at $60, $70 for the last 10 years. Before that, suddenly in 6 months from January 2008 to July 2008, it shot up to $147 per barrel. And in that process, everything that investment banks told you about risk mitigation, risk management, using fuel hedging strategies, well, that all got thrown out of the window, because the same risk mitigation strategies actually caused 50 airlines around the world to go bust, because these strategies were not designed to deal with such extreme volatility. Because just as soon as it touched $147 a barrel in July 2008, and you try to lock in all of your fuel prices, guess where it went in December of 2008, 6 months after that, all the way to $32 a barrel, right? And so in one single year, everything came apart. And on top of that, right, that whole process, we had to deal with extremely restrictive market access policies and regulations. We're not allowed to fly on the same routes as the national carrier. And you had to deal with the situation where, do you simply accept limiting policies and regulations, or do you have to kind of completely think around how do we get around this and how do we reshape the regulatory landscape? And soon after that, again, just, for me, one after the other in terms of natural disasters, from the Icelandic volcanic eruption in 2010 that completely shut off the European airspace just as we started flying to London. Now, of course, it was only for 6 days, but when we started, we had no idea how long this was going to be. As soon as we recovered that, we started flying to Tokyo. And barely a few months after that, we had the Tohoku nuclear disaster, earthquake, tsunami, all in one. And we have people who desperately needed flights, but at the same time, we also had people saying, I want refunds. I don't ever want to fly to Japan again. Pilots saying, look, I don't want to go and get exposed to nuclear radiation. How do you balance all of this? Just as soon as we had recovered from that, we started flying to Christchurch. And lo and behold, in 2012, 2 big earthquakes in Christchurch. So be very careful wherever I plan to go, because somehow earthquakes follow me. And if you think it stopped at Christchurch, in 2015, I had made plans to go on an Everest base camp solo adventure, and I had everything planned. My flight there to Kathmandu was on, I think, Saturday, or on Monday, April 24th, 25th. 2 days before that was the Kathmandu earthquake. So there you go. And it wasn't just that. I mean, 2014, completely a massive year, because right after our IPO, we had not one, not two, but three black swan events: MH370, MH17, and QZ8501, where literally everything fell apart because the markets like China and Australia massively crashed because of these incidents. And it wasn't just these professional events. For me, 2018, you know, as I was planning, I'm an active triathlete. 2018 in May 13th, 2018, for the first time going from a sort of a recreational triathlete, I actually managed to qualify for the Ironman 70.3 World Championships in South Africa, to be held in September 2018. But 2 weeks after that, kind of just on a short warm-up ride around Bangsa, near where I lived, next thing you know, a car came from behind at very, very high speeds and just knocked me out completely. It caused a lot of brain injuries, spinal injuries, 3 out of my 4 limbs broken, as you can see. But, you know, it caused a lot of dark moments for me, because suddenly my new startup was hanging in the balance. You don't know how you're going to take care of your family, your employees. It looked really, really dark. But it was in the process of dealing with that and talking to people and seeking support, I discovered that, you know, ultimately for me, it was, you know, what can I do out of this situation? And you know, what message did I want to share with my children? Which is, you know, to me, life is not about avoiding risks. You've got to put yourself out there, and inevitably life's going to knock you down hard. In this case, literally knock you down. But the one thing that I want to share with my children was not about avoiding risk, but about picking yourself up and going. And for those parents out there, you'll know children never listen to what you say, but they will watch what you do. And the best way to communicate that lesson was to be able to show them that I could get back myself up, and just started to walk on day 33, started to do indoor running in day 47, day 62, I went back up. Day 84 was especially emotional, to get back on my bicycle and to ride outdoors again. Day 112, swimming after I could gain mobility in my broken shoulder, you know, with rotation. And finally, in less than 6 months after that accident, to be able to, although I missed the Ironman World Championships in September, but in November 2018, to be able to go back to Langkawi, the Ironman 70.3 race, and complete it. So, you know, it's been an insane period going through this tumultuous journey. And I want to sort of stop there and kind of reflect back, you know, how we find ourselves in these moments where you just simply cannot predict. Because my one lesson is, you know, life never goes according to our plans. And yet our brains basically are wired for one thing. Our brains are wired for survival. It prefers stability, it prefers reliability and predictability. It doesn't like volatility, uncertainty, and ambiguity, and it sends us signals to avoid things that are unknown, right? So in fact, for example, the way the brain works is at any one moment, we may be getting 50 million different sensory inputs, but we're only consciously processing 10, right? And how does it filter out the other 49.99 million? It filters it out based on what it already understands. So for example, right now, you might be listening to me, what I say, but you're actually only going to be retaining information that you agree with. And any information that you disagree with, you're going to be filtering that out. It's like, you know, when we interview candidates, you might think, okay, you're going through a 1-hour interview for this candidate, but you've actually subconsciously, not aware of it, but you're subconsciously made up your mind in the first 10 seconds of meeting that candidate. Sometimes even before that candidate says a single word, your brain has already said, I either want this person, I don't want this person. And anything that comes out in that conversation, in that interview, you'll be retaining things that confirm your first belief, your gut instinct, and filtering out everything that goes against your gut instinct. Same thing with even investments. You think you go through a proper investment due diligence, but actually your brain's already made up its mind whether you want to go through that investment or not. And it's kind of refiltering your focus based on what you're comfortable with, right? And so that's why we tend to revert back to what we're familiar with in the past. So for example, right, the other thing that causes these filters is our past successes, right? So take AirAsia. People might associate it, as some people at least, that it's a dynamic, innovative, and risk-taking brand. But the moment it became successful, it too started to have very fixed beliefs about what is or is not possible in that industry, right? And it kind of really stuck to it. Even board members and shareholders had very fixed beliefs, for example, in 2007 that said, oh, long haul cannot work, right? Because the global giants say it cannot be done, because industry experts say it cannot be done, because everyone else who's ever tried it before says it cannot be done. And it required someone from outside the industry to challenge these beliefs. Because internally, once you have these past successes, you hold on to what's made you successful in the past. Same thing even with Astro, right? So for 20 years, dominant, unchallenged, where they really believed in the model with set-top boxes and channels. And over the last few years, as you can see, that whole industry has gone completely disruptive, because the idea of a set-top box makes no sense at all in today's world where all of our mobile phones have far more computing power than these set-top boxes. Channels don't make sense at all, because today we should be able to watch whatever we want, whenever we want, right? We don't need a separate box for every room that we go to. But yet, because of 20 plus years of successfully doing things one way, it becomes very, very hard to completely pivot, right? And so past successes can also be a big limiting factor to thinking about it. Now, the other thing to understand is, in these stressful situations, what is stress? So stress, first of all, for example, is a completely normal human emotion, right? It is something that evolutionary is something to protect us. So for example, animals, right? If you are an antelope gazing in the savannah, you're kind of nicely, comfortably gazing in on the savannah, and suddenly you see from the corner of your eye, a lion starts to attack you, right? Immediately, the stress hormones get triggered. Your heart starts beeping faster, blood pressure is higher, your muscles starts to pump, and you immediately outsprint the lion. Now, usually, lions, when they start to go after their prey, they only have about 20 or 30 seconds worth of sprinting. After that, the lion's going to go, oh, too tired, right? So if you're an antelope, all you need to do is just outsprint that lion for 20 to 30 seconds. Now, the cool thing about an antelope is once that lion gives up, and you can see that lion panting, and that lion may only be about 50 meters away, the amazing thing about these antelopes is it can immediately, the stress hormones just go away, and it can start grazing again, right? So with animals, stress was just for that one moment when there's a danger, and the moment that danger goes away, things go back to normal. Problem with humans is we've evolved to the point where we've developed something, for better or worse, called memory. And memory creates something where suddenly these stress hormones don't go away, to the point where we even evolved to create anxiety. Anxiety, the difference between anxiety and stress is, anxiety is when we start to worry about a threat even before that threat is not there. Even if the lion is not there, we start to worry, could there be a potential lion, right? And so at some point, the anxiety starts to keep playing that video in your head, that threat. We start to actually believe in that threat, and we start to get triggered with the blood pressure and heartbeat and muscles pumping nonstop, even when that threat isn't there. So in a way, one way of thinking about anxiety is these videos that are playing in our head over and over again about a potential threat even before that threat comes. And actually depression, similarly, is this video playing in our head over and over and over again of something that has already happened in the past, where it may cause extreme sadness, extreme, where we start to ruminate about why things happen in the past. And for some of us, that video doesn't stop in our head. Now, most of us, we can self-regulate. We can, that video sort of goes away after a day or two. But for some people, it goes prolonged. And where the problem lies is if it starts to go beyond 14 days, right? Where that video keeps playing in your head over and over again. You cannot concentrate, and it impairs your ability to do your daily tasks. It affects your sleep. That's where it starts to become chronic stress. That's where it starts to become an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, because we can no longer function, because that these videos, these thoughts in our head just don't stop playing at all. Now, just to give you a sense of what happens when the brain goes on repeat video playing. So in a typical Ironman race, for example, in that one day, I might be burning about 6,000 calories of energy. That's a lot, right? That's a lot of nasi lemak eating and just burning it throughout the day. But here's an interesting fact. A world champion chess grandmaster at a world championship chess tournament burns 6,000 calories from thinking. See, now now that you know this, you no longer need to exercise. Just play chess and you're going to lose weight. But the difference isn't actually the act of playing chess. It's not about moving chess pieces and suddenly you burn 6,000 calories. It's the thought process. Our brains only represent about 2% of our body weight, but it consumes over 20% of the energy in our body, right? And so when it is going at high speeds, it's consuming a lot of energy, which is why people who start to develop depression and anxiety get completely exhausted, get completely tired from just that video playing nonstop over and over again. And that's just to illustrate the power of having these thoughts that are just, flooding our minds and causing us to get incredibly tired from that process. So as leaders, knowing that we're now confronted with an extremely stressful situation, how are we going to lead our teams? And coming from the airline industry, the first thing is, as most of us, our flyers will notice, when the flight attendants make a safety video demonstration, you'll remember one of the first things that get emphasized is, please put on your mask on first before helping others, especially before helping your children. The reality actually is, for a lot of people in that situation, your first instinct is probably, I need to put on that mask for my children first before myself. But there's very good reason, a scientific reason, why it's important to take care of ourselves first before we're able to be effective leaders, right? So here's what I mean by, for example, protecting our emotions as a leader, as a manager, because in situations like this, it's easy to get overly anxious, right? And you start, for example, furiously send emails at night, frantically trying to catch up or make progress on something that you feel is important. And suddenly, without us realizing, we start to stress out our direct reports, right? Because they're going to feel obligated to respond immediately, and that stress ripples through the whole company. So actually learning how to manage our stress and our anxiety and our emotions is critical to lead teams in these times, right? So one, for example, gut check for me is to be very conscious of the communications that we give our team members, especially written communications, right? Emails, text messages. Are we sending the right signals? Because, for us to proofread what we say and how it might be easily misinterpreted. And one specific thing I want to share, right? As we deal with a situation where our employees are bound to make mistakes, right? Consider the difference between why questions and how questions, right? When things don't go according to plan, one of our common instinctive responses as a leader is to ask our team members, why did this happen? Why was this mistake done, right? And you can imagine the difference if someone tells you, why did this happen? Versus a how statement or a how question, which is, how can we prevent this from happening again, right? That first set of questions causes people to feel like they're being judged, right? And it creates this defensive mode of people sort of just pointing fingers, coming up with reasons, as opposed to orienting our team to say, look, what's happened has happened. How can we prevent this from happening again, right? So it's important to understand how questions can be a lot more effective with our team members than why questions. Now, the early precursor to stress and anxiety and depression is actually mind wandering, right? And a lot of us can relate to this, where mind wandering is this shift in the contents of our thought away from our ongoing task, right? Or from the events that we're dealing with. So interestingly, from the average person, mind wandering happens about 47% of our waking hours. That's a lot of time, whereas we're trying to write a report or read or communicate with someone. Even as you're probably listening to me right now, some of you have thoughts going to another place, right? Now, if you can imagine, what are activities that cause that number to be even higher, right? What would trigger someone to have a mind wandering all over the place longer than just 47%? So clearly one of them is multitasking, right? A lot of us try to do too many things in parallel. And what happens with multitasking is we're trying to tell our brain to move between different thoughts and different parts or different actions, sort of trying to read emails while listening to something and while trying to do this. And the more we try to do that, the more we encourage our mind to start wonder. And when we start doing this, the more it starts to look for things that it's concerned about, right? Thoughts that cause anxiety, thoughts that cause depression when we reflect or ruminate about the past, right? So it's important to understand why mind wandering happens and what are the things that cause us to subconsciously train the mind to encourage mind wandering, which is of course not great as a leader, but what can we do about it, right? So when I think about crisis leadership traits, three things come to mind, and I'm a bit of a fanboy for Dato' Mazlan Osman, but three things are being composed, being curious, and being energetic. I deliberately canceled the word calm because in moments of crisis, moments of stress, when we try to tell ourselves to calm down, that doesn't work because there are natural emotions and hormones running through our bodies, right? If cortisol is flooding our body, if adrenaline is flooding our bodies, telling ourselves or telling our team members just calm down doesn't work because it doesn't fit with the biological reactions that we're dealing with. Instead, what's interesting is fear, for example, has the same biological reaction as excitement. So for example, if any of you are nervous flyers, right? You're flying on a plane and suddenly there's a lot of turbulence and that might cause you anxiety and worry. One way of dealing with that, for example, is to keep telling ourselves over and over again, this is exciting. When I get home, I'm going to tell my friends about it. This is exciting. When I get home, I'm going to tell my friends about it. And you might think this is kind of very simplistic, but as we start to rewire this as excitement, we're telling our brain, here's external stimuli. I'm framing this as excitement. And when you tell yourself, I'm going to tell my friends about it when I get home, you're telling yourself, I'm going to survive this, right? And actually, after a few minutes, the body's reaction changes because you're framing the situation differently. And so in moments of crisis, it's not about being calm, but it's about being able to be composed rather than being calm and channeling that to curiosity rather than being worried or not being careful not to fall back on our fixed beliefs about what's happened in the past, right? And channeling energy rather than trying to suppress that natural energy that comes up. So how do we develop these three traits? Now, this might sound kind of sort of common, but actually, if you think about it, what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is basically a way to train our body to reduce mind wandering. Now, mindfulness doesn't have to be about meditation or kind of just sort of focusing on breath. There are many ways that we can be mindful. One of the techniques, for example, is during eating, right? To be a mindful eating, having a mindful meal, and that's a whole story about that. Or even when we're exercising, being mindful, because all it means is by learning to train our brains to focus on the present, right? It sort of stops that video playing in our head, the either anxiety videos about the future or the depressive videos about the past. So for example, for the triathletes out there, one of the things, if you're running the marathon leg of an Ironman triathlon, the difference between a standalone marathon and a triathlon is, you start running a triathlon in the middle of the day or in the afternoon, because you start by swimming first, and then you got to cycle a very long distance, and then you start running. And by the time you start running, it's incredibly hot, right? And so one of the things you'll notice with triathletes is when we're running on the road, we start looking for shade, right? So trees, small shades, we're just gonna run underneath a tree. Because even though that shade just gives us that 2 seconds of respite from the blazing sun, it makes a huge difference over 21 or 42 kilometers. That small break allows us to just kind of not let it kind of, not let the pressure get too big that it becomes out of control. So same thing with being mindfulness, right? Simply pausing our brains for that 1 minute allows us to sort of not let that sort of escalate to the point where it becomes debilitating, right? Exercise. A lot of people, for example, know about this, but there's some exercises that are good for being to develop these 3 leadership traits, and some are not good. A lot of leaders, for example, that I talk about say, yeah, I exercise regularly. What do you do? Oh, every Saturday night we play futsal for 3 hours. What do you do the rest of the week? Nothing, right? So futsal once a week actually causes the body to get into a state of shock, and it actually puts the adrenaline much higher than something that is sort of much more consistent day in and day out, right? Same thing with sleep. So the other thing for me that I think is quite interesting is that when one way of dealing with reducing mind wandering is to recognize that if we can start to focus on our tasks at hand, we can actually achieve higher levels of performance. So peak performance, interestingly, is a state where we start to be able to single-mindedly focus on one task, where the brain starts to go on autopilot, where the hormones are sort of increasing our reflex, our ability to think laterally, increasing pattern recognition, and allows us to perform. But the thing is, performing at our peak only happens with the right amount of stress, with the right amount of challenge, right? Without stress and without challenge, we can't perform at our best. And so as leaders, therefore, we need to recognize that there's an opportunity to turn this into something productive, right? To be able to perform at our best by performing at that optimal level of stress and challenge, and really just focusing in on the task at hand. So stepping back, right? One thing I want to share about our brain. Some of you might have heard that we have a left side of the brain and a right side of the brain, right? And we're told the left side of the brain is our logical side, right? And the right side of the brain is our creative side. Well, if you believe that, unfortunately, that's actually not true. We use both sides of the brain equally for logical and rational tasks, and we use both sides of the brain for creative and artistic pursuits. So the brain actually isn't divided into different regions by the tasks that we do. However, there are differences between the front part of the brain and the back part of the brain. So the front part of the brain here is the prefrontal cortex. That's where the rational thoughts happen, right? As you're listening to me right now, this is the part of the brain that's being engaged. The back part of the brain is the limbic system. It's the more primitive part, and that's where your subconscious, your emotions, your routines, habits, autopilot, all happens at the back. Now, what if I told you that in 1 minute that you're listening to me, there are about 100 synaptic connections happening in the prefrontal cortex at the front? In that same 1 minute, how many connections do you think happens in the back part of the brain? So if this is 100, how many is happening right here at the back? If you're guessing 1,000, 1,000,000, you're going to be way off, because it's closer to over 1 billion connections. So whatever we think logically happens here, it is no match for the amount of processing power that happens at the back. For those of you who are driving, right? Have you ever had this experience where as you're driving your car and you're thinking about stuff, suddenly you find yourself driving to a different destination than what you thought you were supposed to go? When that happens, that's the limbic system taking over. It's kind of following kind of this routine automatic habit. How many of you are breathing right now? Well, so for those of you who are breathing, you're probably not consciously thinking, I've got to inhale, I've got to exhale, I've got to inhale, I've got to exhale. So you notice that a lot of things are being processed at the back that we're not conscious about, right? And that's why when we're trying to change, when we're trying to lead our teams, It's not about what we say and the conscious practices, but if it doesn't get imprinted at the back, it's not going to change. And that's why change is really hard, right? So for example, in health and what I do right now, right? Take people who are told by their doctors, oh, you've got high blood pressure, you've got high blood sugar, you really should watch what you eat, you should start exercising, take this medication regularly and come see me in the next 3 months. Well, what research shows is despite 100% of people saying, buy it, doctor, yes, doctor, I'll do it, when you go home, only 26% of people are actually following what their doctors tell them to do. When it comes to diets, it's even worse, right? 93% of people who start a diet will fail that diet before achieving their goals. Gym memberships, as you can relate to, right? January, gyms are so full. By December, what research shows, only 28% of people are left in the gyms. Fitbits, in January, everybody's excited about their Fitbits. They create a 10,000 step WhatsApp group. You start telling your friends and family members, okay, let's log into all of our 10,000 steps, see how many steps you have today. By December, what research shows, 90% of you have deliberately lost your Fitbits, or you're probably only using it to tell the time, right? Rather than just actually following through on what you say you're going to do. So knowledge alone is not sufficient to change, right? If knowledge alone were enough, we wouldn't have cardiologists who smoke, or we have dietitians who are overweight. We do. So even the experts who know what's good or bad for them still don't practice what they preach. So it's not just about knowledge. Knowledge is here in the prefrontal cortex that we're aware of it, but if it doesn't get imprinted in the back, it's not going to change. And so to me, the equivalent of the limbic system in the workplace is what I call the annual cycle, right? We've got board members trying to tell management that we need you to be more agile, we need you to be more disruptive, moving fast, be disruptive, challenge the status quo. But actually, the board members themselves are very, very reluctant to change. They want their meetings pre-planned for the whole year. I want my board meetings locked into my schedule. I want the agenda and paper sent 1 or 2 weeks before. You like stability, you like predictability, you like reliability, because that is what the brain is comfortable with. It's easy to tell management, but we don't want to change it ourselves, right? And so, that's why we prefer, annual plans, annual budgets, annual performance appraisals. But the reality is the world that we live in today, that's all gone out the window, because things are changing so fast. Whatever you spent months and months presenting to the board to get next year's budget's approval, within the first month or two, the world has changed. All your budget assumptions are thrown out of the window. And it's actually not about planning, but it's about how do we get better responding to change. And that's why, for example, as a startup, well, we don't have size, we don't have balance sheet, we don't have capital, we don't have all the resources as big companies. The one thing I tell my team members is the only sustainable advantage we have is our ability to move fast. Speed is the only sustainable advantage, right? And so how do we think about speed? Basically, whatever big companies do in 1 year, we've got to be able to do it in 1 week, right? And so the ability to move fast is the only thing that keeps us alive, right? And so how do we do that? Number one, being able to define our work in very short sprints, usually 1 or 2 weeks, where we're super crystal clear what needs to get done this week, right? And the way we do that is at the end of that sprint cycle, at the end of, for example, every Friday, asking our team members 3 questions. Number one, what's working, right? If it's working, let's keep doing that the next sprint. Number 2, what's not working? Let's stop doing that. It's amazing how many organizations, if you to ask your team members what's not working in our company, they will give you a long list. So why do we still do it that way? Because that's how we always do things. Because we like predictability, reliability, and stability, even though logically we know it's not working. But the third question is the most important question, which is, what have we learned from this 1 week with our customers, with our suppliers, with our business partners, that we're going to try something new the next sprint? You see, great ideas don't come once a year. Great ideas don't come from once a year board offsites or strategic planning offsites. Because, if we only spend once a year trying to think about what's going to happen, what do we do differently, our brains are conditioned for the whole year to think one way, to just follow our budgets, to look at this column, variance to budget, and kind of just stick to the plan. And once a year, you tell your brain, let's come up with new ideas. That's not how it works. The way it works is actually we're kind of coming up with new ideas constantly and being able to try that. And even if 9 out of 10 ideas don't work, we get better at learning how to come up with great ideas. And that is why even in today's time as leaders, it becomes really important to move at a very, very fast cadence. And that's why daily check-ins become important. Daily checkouts at the end of the day become very important. But what a lot of people may not know that, but they're struggling with that is because they use check-ins to ask their team members, okay, what have you done today, right? And that's not very productive, as opposed to kind of just kind of throwing open-ended questions, right? Like, what are we learning from the front line? What can we do differently, as opposed to just asking people status updates? And so the ability to stay, that crisis is a time where we actually need to be much closer with our team members, especially in a remote situation where we do need to touch base with everyone on a daily basis. But it's important to frame it with, to me, these 3 powerful questions rather than just kind of status updates. And you know, a good analogy for me is Formula One, because Formula One racing is a high stress environment, right? And what a lot of inexperienced drivers are told is, don't think about the whole race, focus on the next corner, right? Get that next corner done. Because once you go through that next corner, you recalibrate, right? Because you look up again and you see, okay, how is the landscape change? What do we need to change for the next corner? So being very, very clear with our team members that we have no idea what's going to happen 6 months from now or 12 months from now, but we're super crystal clear what we need to execute over the next 1 to 2 weeks. And that is why, you know, in times of crisis, you know, understanding that the brain, the way it works is, if we only do things one way, the brain develops a super highway between those 2 connections, right? Whereas what neuroplasticity tells us is, the more we start to challenge our beliefs and try to connect new dots, new data points, the better it gets at learning how to connect new dots. It becomes more plastic, more malleable, more flexible than if we're doing things the same way and then suddenly during crisis, we're told, okay, find out new solutions and think differently. And so training our team members to keep challenging our beliefs, keep challenging our practices every single week is the only way for me to be able to survive and thrive in an environment where we simply have no idea what's going to happen in the coming weeks or months. So one way of doing that, one practical way I want to share with you is these 4 words, or what I call victim versus player, knower versus learner, right? A victim is someone who says, oh, sorry, I'm late. Traffic is bad, right? A player would say, oh, sorry, I'm late. I should have accounted for traffic contingencies. Next time I'm going to plan better. A victim is someone who says, oh, budget overran, vendor's fault. A player would say, oh, budget overran. I think if we had better communicated or coordinated with our vendor, we could have avoided this. Notice the difference. Even if the big problem is externally caused, we look at things as, what could we have done differently? Knowers and learners. Knowers are people who say, I've been in this industry for 30 years. This is the way we can do, we must do it. A learner would say, from my experience, we should be doing it this way. What do you guys think? What am I missing? Opening up the solution space. And the thing is, it's not that one person is one way or the other. Even me, like I wrote a whole book, a chapter on victim, player, knower, learner. I still make victim statements. I still make knower statements. And I'm not conscious of when I make these statements. What I need is for my team members to call me out. And it's hard to give feedback, but the only feedback that works is on the spot live feedback. And so by distilling it into a single word, when a team member can say, Azran, victim, Azran, knower, and I can immediately, oh, let me rephrase that, I start to self-correct immediately, right? And so if we can encourage our team members, even in board meetings, to be aware of victim statements and aware of knower statements, we can start to reorient the language. And just being aware of these 2 mindsets can really change how we operate. So for me, I just want to end with sort of 4 specific things in terms of boards learning from this whole process of operating in a completely uncertain and unpredictable environment. Number 1, people over plans, right? So many boards and management teams spend so much time doing plans after plans after plans, right? Optimistic case, base case, pessimistic case, multiple year projections. I want to know business continuity plan, risk mitigating plan. You plan, but you don't really execute. But what we have learned is that no plan can anticipate what's going to happen in the future. Instead, how much time we should be spending a lot more time on the people who are going to execute this. Do they have the creativity, the openness, the agility, the resilience to deal with the inevitable things that are going to come up? Spending more time evaluating the people who are going to execute than the plans. Secondly, 80-20 forward looking versus 80-20 backward looking. A lot of the airtime in board discussions, are we spending it on looking in the future? Or sometimes boards spend way too much time reviewing past performance. I want to see the last monthly performance, the last quarterly performance, instead of spending that time thinking about forward-looking scenarios. Another thing for me, 80-20, board versus management airtime, right? A lot of times it's 80% airtime taken up by management, presenting, and boards just sitting back and just kind of pointing out gaps or numbers in a column not adding up, as opposed to management saying, hey, these are the 3 issues we're wrestling with, and board members taking up 80% of the airtime, talking about sharing their experiences and having debates about what can happen, right? So we're thinking about reshifting that. And lastly, consider implementing victim, player, knower, learner in board meetings to be aware of how limiting victim statements and knower statements are so frequent in board meetings. And then to use every board meeting to conduct these retrospectives. 3 questions. What's working? Let's keep doing that. What's not working? Let's stop doing that. And the 3rd question, what have we learned that we're going to try something new that we've never tried before? So with that, I'm going to skip this. I want to pause there. I know we want to leave enough time for questions and answers. And I look forward to comments and feedback, and hopefully we can learn together. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks a lot for that, Azran. Graphic pictures aside, I found that really interesting. I mean, I completely am on board with you for a lot of the things, because I think we're also stuck in certain ways of thinking. And if anything, like you said, the crisis has shown us that there is another way of doing things. There is another way of kind of implementing things. And I suppose and I will tell you that I'm one of those who's guilty of driving to places that I didn't actually want to go. Out of the blue, I suddenly went somewhere else. But I think the main thing that more than anything else, and I think some of the questions have addressed this too, is that how do we even start? Does it take, and I understand the whole thing about tragedies and unexpected black swan events. Hell, I was there with you. But how do you even start to do it? Does it take the big shock before you even start to think that maybe my mindset needs to change?
Well, so first of all, that big shock that's what we're living in today, right? This is a completely big shock, right? And this is where we have to decide what are the practices we're going to change. How do we move to a daily cadence with our team members? How do we use how statements instead of why statements? And every single week now, asking our team members the 3 questions. Right? What's working, what's not working, and what one new thing are we going to try differently next week? Challenging ourselves, because the best way to get the good ideas to come out of this is if we go through a lot of bad ideas first.
Okay. So Zato Malik actually points out and asks this, and it pretty much saying what I'm saying, the same thing, that familiar patterns. But you mentioned a lot about knowing versus, victim and everything. How do you best ensure when making decisions that we don't fall back into familiarity? I think the biggest worry a lot of people have is, of course, we're living in extraordinary times, right? But what happens when things do go back to semi-normal? How do you ensure that the best of what we learn from this experience still gets carried forward and not back into the old patterns?
So for me, one thing I've learned, and if there's one thing, it is, as a leader, I got to get comfortable with the fact that I don't have to have all the answers. And what matters is, how do I surround myself with people from different perspectives, right? So not just within my organization, but my bigger networks. And actually boards play a huge role in this, right? To have boards that have very, very different views, but have a language of how do we explore the unknown and challenge our respective beliefs. because the problem of having people with similar backgrounds is we start to have very similar views, right? And so that becomes the danger. So as leaders, how do we surround ourselves with support groups, with our own board of advisors, with our own networks, people who are going to be willing to challenge us on our beliefs? And I think that is more than anything crucial, right? Because if we expect ourselves to have all the answers, I think, we're going to find ourselves in a lot of trouble, as opposed to, now is the time to really rely on people who have completely different perspectives and help us challenge ourselves.
Essentially, you're saying that the board composition or whoever we surround ourselves with, we cannot surround ourselves with people who probably think a lot like us. This is more time to reach out to maybe the unconventional thinkers.
Yep. And the other thing, unfortunately, boards actually are not great at this. Because the reality, let's say as a CEO looking at my board, the one thing that will always be at the back of my mind is they're evaluating me. And if they're evaluating me, I can never be truly open. I can never be, vulnerable about, look, these are things that are keeping me up at night. These are things where I don't have all the answers because boards are judging me, right? So either the chairman and the board have to really create a safe space, or as a CEO, I've got to figure out where's my personal board of advisors, people who understand my situation, and I can go there and be completely vulnerable and open and create a space where I can get true feedback without being judged. And that personally for me has been something that I've benefited over my last 10 years, is having my own personal board of advisors, right? Sort of 8 other people. We meet 8 times a year. So they kind of go through together, sharing that same experience, but creating that safe space. Because without that safe space, we can't really explore without being judged.
Understand. Nurlela Parudin actually has this interesting question. So to business owners and of course whoever is in charge of organizations, the current situation is putting a lot of stress on them. There's commitments to banks looming, employees are homebound, some production work is not moving forward for weeks and beyond, and we don't even know how long this is going to last. So how can we as part of this organization, as part of our organizations, manage a stress level without causing health issues to us, the families, or direct lines? And I will add to that, how do we manage the mental health of the people that we manage to? Because I think not enough is being said about how to manage mental health for staff who worry that tomorrow they won't just have a job anymore.
Absolutely. Look, the reality is, to recap, right? Number one, it starts with ourselves. If we cannot take care of ourselves, we're going to be terrible examples for our team members. Right? So if we tell our team members, yeah, I need you to exercise, I need you to eat well, but I also need you to work throughout the whole night, like that doesn't work, right? So we've got to be able to say, can I discipline myself first, right? So whatever happens, I've got to do my 30 minutes in the morning, right? I've got to be able to eat healthily. Second thing is that how do we communicate with our team members? And this is where suddenly being aware of the language that we use, the time that we send emails, which is why, for me, one of the big things we've done is we say, yes, we're going to do our 9 a.m. daily check-ins on Zoom, but it's very important that we do our 6 p.m. checkouts. That actually is now even more crucial than the check-ins, where the checkout says, all right, guys, let's recap. What are the things that we can start again tomorrow? Because if we don't do that, the likely reaction, the default reaction of our team members is, oh, because my boss has brought it up, I now have to stay all night doing it just to get ready in the morning. And the problem when people do work when they're not rested is the work quality is going to suffer, right? And you just create this vicious cycle. So if we don't set the parameters of when we start and when we end, right, we're just going to work the team to the bone, because suddenly the boundaries between work and life go away in today's remote environment.
I completely agree with you there. I found myself doing work. I don't know how many of our attendees are the same, but do you find yourself doing work at 11 o'clock at night because, oh, it's there, I've done it all day anyway. So I think this setting boundaries may be something that a lot of new thing that a lot of us need to learn, that there is a physical separation between,
Sure.
Work and your home life. Ida asks, how do you generate new ideas with existing staff? This is interesting. It's always said that when you bring in fresh blood, we were just talking about board composition, right? Fresh blood, fresh views. But what if your freshies are few and far between? Essentially, how do you teach an old dog new tricks?
Sure.
Let's put it that way.
So first of all, I just want to challenge that belief because, my right hand man at AirAsia X, Moses Devanayagam, he had retired from Malaysia Airlines, right? 30 years working in the same industry, and you would think someone 30 years from Malaysia Airlines would have very fixed views about what can or cannot be done. But the best ideas at AirAsia X came from Moses. The only difference was that the environment that he operated. If you operated in an environment where you were just told to do what you do, that's what you do. But if we could create that environment where we sort of challenge him to say, hey, what about this? What about that, right? How can we do this differently? Suddenly, even those old dogs can learn new tricks if you set the right environment. And that right environment that I just shared today is two things, right? One, using how questions rather than why, so that we don't judge people, so they feel more comfortable talking about what can we do differently. And third, the process of having that conversation every single week, right? If you have a retrospective every single week, that third question, right? The first 3 or 4 times you do this, people are going to go, I don't know what to say, because they're thinking my boss wants an answer. So what does my boss want me to say, right? But it takes a few weeks before they realize, oh, we can actually bring up problems and we're not going to get judged. And from those problems, new ideas come up. And in the interest of time, I won't share, but so many new ideas, new innovative ideas came when people were finally comfortable to bring up problems in the first place, because they felt comfortable they were not going to be judged.
I think that not going to be judged thing is going to be something I hope that a lot of boards kind of take forward, because we are judged every day in our lives anyway. Having a safe space, I think, in work would actually be very beneficial for people, at least for expanding ideas. And actually, speaking of that, Jiale Lu actually says, you've gone through so much turbulence in your life for the past 20 years. Hair. Yeah, it's so much so in so many areas. Surely they say your emotions must have been affected at some point, despite how strong you are. Yeah. So what are your key beacons for guiding you through that? You did mention when we were going through your photos that there were some dark parts after your unfortunate accident. Yeah. So how do you get through that? And I don't even mean this jokingly, not cuddle up in a ball in the corner, and worry.
So first of all, just to dispel the myth that I shared just now, the recovery was not linear. Nothing is linear in life, right? Like you feel great 1 or 2 weeks and suddenly out of the blue, this just bad bout of depression hits in. You just sort of lie in I suddenly found myself on my toilet for a whole hour, completely just couldn't move, because everything came crashing, right? And so just when you think you have momentum, it happens. So first of all, just being aware that that's a completely normal experience. 2, over and over again, sounding like a broken record, but it's almost impossible to go through this by yourself. And so the people that you choose to surround yourself with matters a lot. Now, I'm fortunate because in 2018, because of what we do at Naluri, I have my own team of psychologists. I've got my own team of dietitians and doctors and fitness coaches, executive coaches, financial planners. And so they help me sort of think about what are the different options that I can and why I have certain beliefs. And they sort of give me points to make me reflect, I guess that might not be true, right? There might be different ways of looking at things. So how we choose to surround ourselves with people who will allow us to be mirrors, right? Here's the one question for everyone. Who are mirrors in your life that will truly reflect back to you as is, unadulterated, unfiltered? And if we can choose the right mirrors in our life, people who will be genuinely honest with us and not judge us, I think that's a big part of the recovery process.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions here. Dr. Mustaqiza actually asked, speaking about mental fortitude, how do we teach our brains continuously to be more composed in making difficult decisions in an unprecedented time? I know that that's difficult for me. It's sure. Rational thinking sometimes it just goes out the window, because you're saying, what's the point of making plans when 6 months from now it doesn't, it might be completely kind of different. Yep. And the other one is Zulaifa asking this: what has been the most effective technique you have to overcome this knower versus learner language? You said you surround yourself with people, but there's something that you can sort of instill in yourself, like breathing, that yep. The minute you check yourself all the time.
Completely. So here's the thing. what we're trying to target is the right amount of stress, the right amount of anxiety. In fact, there's a word for it. It's called eustress, which is good stress. And so we can't perform without any stress at all. So just to caveat, right? It's not about eliminating stress, but it's how do I get to the right amount without it kind of being too overwhelming. And that is why it comes back down to those three basic things. Sleep. Without sleep, our brains just kind of reprocess and kind of let go. And that's why for me, one of the key tips that I have is having my pen and notebook on my bedside table. Because like everyone, I wake up in the middle of the night, 11 p.m., 3 a.m. with a thought. And the problem is, if I don't write it down, as much as I want to go back to sleep, my brain is going around in circles because it doesn't want me to forget that thought or idea. So by writing it down, I'm giving myself permission to, okay, let go of that thought. I'll get to it in the morning, right? The other thing is exercise, because exercise allows us to better regulate so that when we're stressful, we learn like that antelope for the stress to sort of go back again. And there's this right optimal exercise based on heart rate intensity. Too little, you're not going to get any effect. Too intense, you're going to create a lot of distress, physical distress to the heart and the lung system. So that regularity is a big part of regulating those emotions. And lastly, for me, it's mindfulness. It's not something that's just a matter of simply breathing, but when you're mindful of eating, when you're mindful of exercising, when you're mindful of having conversations with your spouse over dinner without having your phone and trying to multitask, right? So simply put, if we can avoid multitasking and kind of being present when we're talking to people, that allows the brain to sort of like go deeper rather than going all over the place. So the single biggest enemy here that we're trying to deal with is mind wandering. If you can control mind wandering, you've set the right foundation.
Okay, I think that's going to be harder to teach, I think, for some people, because we're so used to being pulled in so many directions, right? As our attention's pulled in 7 directions at once to try and kind of build that kind of focus. Somebody was asking also, talking about how successful entrepreneurs show high level and dominance and trust as well as mental fitness. So what are the key traits that boards can draw from entrepreneurs such as that to build stronger mental fitness for the organizations that they lead? Also, because like I said earlier, my biggest fear is that we learn nothing from this and go back to doing board papers and yearly things and doing the old way about it.
So a couple of things. Number one, how do you genuinely encourage failure, right? But not repetitive failure, but failure where you learn. Right? Because it's the one thing that a lot of our management and our employees are afraid of is being judged. So if you're willing to create a space where people feel, I do this and we learn, right? So I'll just to share one story. How many of you are familiar with Amazon Go? Right? Amazon Go is the giant e-commerce giant getting into the supermarket business, right? So interesting, supermarket business for an online retailer. But right? What's the one pain point of going to a supermarket today? What are you what sucks the most about the supermarket experience today, especially now during the COVID-19 queuing, right? So you have to like line up and then you got to get everything out, check, and then pack everything again, right? So what Amazon did is they said, imagine if we could use sensors and AI technology so you can walk into the supermarket, take everything that you want and just walk out. How cool is that, right? And when they launched that in January 2017, they put out a YouTube video on Amazon Go, which you can check out. But that's not the story. The story is the moment that went live, right, and it went on YouTube, the senior executive team of Carrefour, the French giant retailer, saw that video. And when they saw that video, their reaction was, we had that idea first 3 years ago, but they did not implement it. You see, a lot of innovation actually comes from traditional companies. Like Kodak, right? Digital photography was actually pioneered by Kodak engineers. But why did Carrefour not implement it? Because they had a risk management committee. And that risk management committee said, well, what happens if someone doesn't have the app and just walks in, steals everything and just runs out? How are you going to control that? Right? And so when you're worried about one downside, you don't implement. Turns out Amazon Go, when they launched this, they too hadn't figured out that part. And so when I was in San Francisco in 2017, right, and visited an Amazon Go store, they had to have security guards outside to check that you've got an app. Okay, now you can go in. Now I can see you go out. So what that means is when you've got a great idea, you launch it. And you launch it and you learn by doing it instead of worrying about, oh, this downside scenario is not mitigated, so we don't launch it at all. Right? And so that is the biggest mindset difference. If you want to wait until all the risks are identified and mitigated, you're never going to learn. And we learn by doing, not by learning by planning.
We'll finish up on one question very related to that from Jennifer Thien, which is risk-taking. How can we actually practically nurture this mindset and culture into this organization? Very apt question.
Sure. Again, right? Challenge yourselves, put it on your calendar. Calendar is the single most important productivity tool, which is every Friday, ask my team the third question, which is, what's the one thing we're going to do differently next week? Okay. Right? So many people today are listening to me, but I guarantee you 90% of the people on this call are not going to do it because they're comfortable. The brain is comfortable doing things regularly. After this call, you go back to how you're normally doing things. But my challenge to you is put it on the calendar right now, which is, let's say, Friday at 4, Friday at 5. I'm going to ask my team this question. And they're going to look at you weird because they've never done this before, right? And it's okay to have really dumb things come out of that process. But it's how you respond to that, right? And not judge them by their dumb ideas, but say, hey, cool, build on that next week, build on that next week, right? And so the only great way of coming up with new ideas is to allow that ideation to happen regularly. Because after 3 or 4 weeks, gems will come out.
All right. And with that, we come to the end of our webinar for today. Thanks so much, Azran, for that. I found it really, really insightful, actually, as always. But, you know, thank you to everybody who attended for their participation and question. We apologize that we didn't have enough time to accommodate everyone, but it is so much appreciated. Your participation, your comments are so much appreciated. I cannot say that enough. And also feel free to go through the chat box. We've had a number of really interesting discussions take place there. And of course, we always want to hear from you. Please use the survey link in the chat box or scan the QR code available to provide feedback and topics of interest. Thanks again, Azran. ICDM will be rolling out online program series soon. Watch this space. If you want to get ahead of the curve and know it earlier, there is the email at development@icdm.com.my or icdm.com.my. Tomorrow, we will have something special, which is the ICDM online Power Talk series, talking about the path to the next normal. So what's now for leadership? Our speaker is James McCulloch, Chief Executive, Inspire Group Asia for New Zealand. See you all at the next webinar. All of you be safe, protect yourselves and your loved ones. Thank you very much.